today's program is entitled, If These Walls Could Talk. And Ben Barrington's our presenter today, and Ben's a former state of Tennessee employee, and in that capacity he documented historic structures and is presently living in a reconstructed historic log structure of his own doing. So please join me as we welcome Ben to give our presentation.
Thank you, Randall. Well, thank you for having me. I'll tell you not a whole lot about my past, and Teresa will tell you I'm not one to talk about what I've done in my life experiences, but I did have the opportunity early in my career to work for the state of Tennessee and as the position of Historic Projects Officer for the Tennessee Historical Commission way back in those early days. I did get a degree at the University of Tennessee and in Middle Tennessee State University in the fields of anthropology and in the fields of historic preservation. So that's sort of my background as far as education and work is concerned. My lifelong love has been with history, and I was just sitting here thinking a minute ago, history is something that we often think never changes, or what history doesn't change, but usually our perception of the facts of history do change as we find out things that we thought were exact facts. Many years ago, we find out later on that those facts maybe not so true. And so, but that's the fun part of history, is actually discovering those hidden mysteries of things. And today I want to talk to you about some of the historic structures, some of the early historic structures that do still exist. Some of them do still exist in the state of Tennessee. Some of them have long gone, unfortunately, but I'm going to show you some of those images and talk to you about the principles of how early structures were built here in the state and on the frontier, actually even before Tennessee becomes a state in some cases, before 1796. And so what I want to talk about is what we most think about, and when we first see a historic structure, we'll look at and often ask the questions and wonder, boy, we see this building, we walk inside, we just marvel at its existence. And the first thing that usually comes to mind is, what do you say? Usually, boy, if these walls could talk, right? What kind of stories could they tell us? And so that's what I want to try to look at today. Obviously, we can't find all of the stories, but surely, in some cases, we can find some of those stories out. And they're so very interesting as we go along this discovery path. So, one of the first questions, obviously, is, do they have a story, and is it possible that that story might be shared with us? Today, when we visit a fascinating historic log building, we often find ourselves wondering what life was like for people who originally built and lived in them. Along with the following questions: when do you think it was built? How old is it? Who built it? Why did they build it? How did they build it this way? Those are the obvious questions that we almost always answer or ask ourselves about it. And as a historic preservationist in the past, if I'm giving a tour in a historic house or if I'm with someone, those are always the questions that come to mind. As a matter of fact, as a state employee, not any credit to me, basically, but I had several people that would be writing books about early Tennessee houses, and they would come to me and they would say, I want you to go with me today. We're going to go look at some buildings because I need to know how old it is. And so they would use me as their sort of guide point, is to point out different features of the house so that it would give them some indication as to how old the house would be, how long it had been since it had been made. We ask these questions because most of the construction techniques our forefathers used, and their living conditions are foreign to us now. Maybe not as perplexing as how the Egyptians built the pyramids of Egypt or how the Inca stonework of Machu Picchu in Peru was fabricated, but curious nonetheless. In any case, for those of us who are curious and interested in learning about historic buildings and building fabric, we find ourselves pondering intently on these questions. To start, let's look at the first question. Does a building have a story? And you think about your own house you live in. Does it have a story? And I think your answer is going to be yes, it has a story. It has a story about your life. Same thing with these historic buildings. They have a story about the people who lived there and lived in them. And that's the excitement of this for me, is to find out about those stories. What can we find out about it as the people are long gone? A lot of the family stories are just stories, or they're just gone, into the wind. And so can we find out any of these interesting stories of how the people and what the people did as they lived in these houses? In any case, for those of us who are curious and interested in learning about the historic buildings and building fabric, we found ourselves pondering about these questions. So let's look. Can we get some of these walls to talk? We think. We possibly can if we know where and how to look. Before we go any further into these questions about early Tennessee log buildings, we need to further take a look at the larger picture, and that picture deals with the beginning of Tennessee's history. Today it's accepted that the first building built by our European ancestors on lands that would become Tennessee was a small hunting refuge of logs built by the famous Daniel Boone, along with accompanying log hunters from Virginia and North Carolina. This seemingly insignificant log structure, constructed on the banks of a small spring-fed creek that flows into the South Fork of the Holston River, became the temporary home of the first permanent white settler in what was to become the state of Tennessee. Many of you know his name? Captain William Bean. After the Treaty of Hard Labor was signed with the Cherokees on October the 17th, 1768, William Bean, with his family, moved from the Dan River area of southeast Virginia to that little hunting cabin on what is now called Boone Creek. It is here that his wife Lydia gave birth to their last child by the name of Russell, and that famous, if you're familiar with the Bean family, the famous Russell Bean. And so that's where he was born. This is the marker that was placed there by the DAR in 1925, locating the location of the first Bean cabin that was part of that original Daniel Boone cabin. When Boone Lake was formed on Watauga River, the TVA had to move the marker up the hill about 90 feet, but it's still in that relatively same location there just outside of Johnson City. The stone that you see there is actually the stone that was in the foundation in the chimney of Captain William Bean's cabin, his first log cabin. That was the only thing that remained by 1925, but they incorporated that into the marker, for that marker. For years, explorers, traders, and hunters had traversed these Indian lands and beyond, but none had made an established settlement before the Bean family. However, very quickly, and one could say almost simultaneously, other settlers followed the Beans into the fertile lands and the Tennessee Valley and began clearing and planting trees and constructing shelters. Some even pushed beyond that treaty line of 1768. Even though this presentation is not about the politics of the time, these events do have a bearing on the pioneer's desire for a type of dwelling that would afford his family as much protection as possible from problems arising from human conflict, as well as those dished out by Mother Nature. It is safe to say that most of the earliest structures built on the Tennessee frontier were of the log type. But it is here that we need to consider one of those other perpetual questions from our beginning is, how did they actually do that? How did they construct such heavy logs and deal with such heavy logs by themselves? This is one of my favorite images. This young lady is in a ferry boat on the Pigeon River just outside of Newport, Tennessee. And you can see by the expression on her face, and that would sort of answer, was it just pugnacious grit that these frontiersmen did those log buildings with them? Today we have a very romantic mental image of a self-reliant man or woman taking axe in hand and marching off into the wilderness and single-handed chopping down an average of 51 to 2,000 ton logs, green logs by the way, to build a 1.5-story log cabin. After a hearty lunch, the would-be Paul Bunyan shouldered his special hewing axes and gauging tools, hew the logs flat on 2 faces, as you see here on the table, carry them 2 by 2 to the building site, carve in the designed corner notches, and stack the logs up the 4 walls 1 by 1 to a vertical height of not less than 20 feet. And the second day, I think you're beginning to see maybe my story is not very real. But nonetheless, we do need to realize it is by the time the pioneering Beans and others moved into the Tennessee frontier, craft guilds in the British colonies, which North Carolina and the would-be territory of Tennessee was a British colony, had well been established. Specialized tradesmen were the frontiersmen. We can say with almost undisputed certainty that all of these settlers would appoint farmers for sustenance, but skilled tradesmen for their livelihood. Jonesboro, the first town established in the Tennessee Territory in 1777, very quickly boasted available services such as store-bought goods shipped in along the Great Wagon Road from as far away as Baltimore and Philadelphia. And you can see from this slide that in red, the wagon road that came all the way from the upper colonies straight right on down to Jonesboro and Knoxville in 1770. You know, maybe not so much as a backwoods frontier as we were thinking. Early patrons of Jonesboro's businesses could trade for feathers or furs, silk or salt, iron ore or iron pots, gloves or guns, wheat or meat, or hire special tradesmen to make carts or carriages, boots or hats, and even furniture or commercial, governmental, and domestic housing. Historic documents show proof of these guilds that were so beneficial to the survival of the pioneer, for we have to realize, like the story of the lone self-reliant house builder, he cannot accomplish such a feat by himself, especially if he were not trained in the craft, or of the housewriter joiner, or didn't have the tools at hand to do so. Well, maybe not so, as we look at this image. Here we have a 1900 image of a young man, very proud young man with an axe on his shoulder. His wife in the doorway, and if you look around, you'll see their toys sitting on the ground, where he has actually taken his axe and fabricated a shelter for his family. So it could be done, but not necessarily the type of log house that we think of. You know, he was able to gather and cobble together all different kinds of components in order to build this structure. This is from the National Park Service, by the way. I'll give credit to them for that. Very interesting to see the type of construction that he had at hand in order to do it. So let's take a look at some of the 18th century finely built homes on the Tennessee frontier. And I'll stop right here because when I first started in this field of restoration and preservation, I was told that there were no 18th century houses left in Tennessee. They had all rotted away. The only houses or structures that were left were early 19th century houses, and that was the only thing that would be available to see today. Thankfully, we have found lately that that's not true. We do have some still existing 18th century structures that dot our landscape, and so very proudly we do want to take care of those. This next home, some of you may or may not be familiar with this, but just a few miles from the Bean Cabin on Boone Creek is a home that's now being taken care of by the Sycamore Shoals National Park. This is the home of Colonel John Carter. This is now Carter's Mansion. It is a state historic site. This home was built in 1780. We know that because historical documents say that, along with some dendrochronology and things that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but the historical documents state that Colonel John Carter stored powder and lead in the stone basement of this house for the soldiers going off to Kings Mountain. And so it was there during the Revolution, so prior to 1781, before going to Kings Mountain. This house is now considered the oldest frame house in Tennessee, in Elizabethton, Tennessee. This next home, sadly, no longer exists, but it is Plum Grove. Plum Grove, we feel like, was probably the second home of Governor John Sevier. The home at Marble Springs, dendrochronology has pretty much verified that John Sevier never lived in the home at Marble Springs, that he lives at Marble Springs. It was built way too long after his passing. And so this home would have been one of the remaining homes that Governor John Sevier lived in. It is situated This site is situated on Highway 107 and Katy Branch. And Katy Branch is for, who would you guess? Bonnie Kate Sorrell. That's his wife. And so this home was standing when this picture was made, when the DAR put the marker there in the 1920s, once again, and soon after, by the 1960s, the property went to the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency, and by 1966, the Historic Preservation Act came into effect that stated that all historic homes or all historic sites that were present on public land had to be maintained. Well, unfortunately, the politics was not very good at that time, evidently, and so the TWRA tore the building down. They left the chimney, and in 1980, I was approached by some local people to have some funding to restore the chimney, or at least stabilize the chimney, which we did through the Tennessee Historical Commission grants. We had it restored, at least stabilized, and so that we could at least maintain the monument of the home of Governor John Sevier. Evidently, the TWRA didn't appreciate that, so I'm not sure whether the building, the chimney even stands today, but fortunately, all the years later, this last April, one of the descendants of John Sevier was able to convince the Tennessee Historical Commission and state legislature to recognize this site as one of the official homes of Governor John Sevier, which they did, and they placed a new historical marker there. There was a nice ceremony back at the end of April. I'm sorry that I missed that, but I was so glad that it was done. At least the site gets its recognition. But this log building, as we can see from this 1920s picture, very large and sprawling log house. It is what's called a V-notch log house. The corner notchings are V-notching, and we'll talk about some of the notching techniques in just a few minutes. And if you're familiar with John Sevier's rival, who would that be?
Tipton.
Colonel John Tipton. And this is the Tipton Haynes, or Colonel John Tipton's home there outside of Johnson City. It still stands. It is a state historic site. It is classed as the Tipton Haynes home. And this is a log house built before 1784. And we know that this house was standing at the time of the the Battle of Franklin, between John Tipton's military force and John Sevier's military force. And so this house was on the site of that battleground outside there of Johnson City. And it is a V-notch log structure as well. And it is almost a two-story building that we see here. And it still stands. The next home we're going to look at, next log building, is the Henry Ernest Fort House in the community of Chuckey, Tennessee, in Greene County. It was built before 1784. It is also a V-notch log joinery. It's a full two-story over a full stone basement. The reason it was called a fort house is because of the way it looks. Now, we do not have real documentation that suggested it was ever used as a fortification like a blockhouse, but it is stately in its manner anyway. Some of the chinking in these early houses, if you're familiar with what chinking and daubing is, well, that's two components. The chinking in this house is all of stone, and we'll talk about the possible reasons for that in a few minutes. This next home is probably not as well known, but you may know the builder. This was built by one of Tennessee's early accepted, as the earliest accepted housewright and furniture maker, Moses Crawford. This is the home of his family, John and Samuel Crawford, that he built, and they were all veterans of Kings Mountain. One distinguishing factor about this house is that the corner notching is not half dovetail or V-notching, it is diamond notching, which is extremely rare. But this building, as I understand, still stands at some level of completeness, still on its original location. And so I think one of our friends has an actual photograph of this. Buford, we're glad it has an image of it. This building is made of two log pins, and we'll talk about the configuration of log structures in a few minutes as well. And it was expanded. But the unique thing about this house is that it is diamond notching. But there's also another unique component that we're going to deal with in just a minute, and that has to deal with Moses Crawford. And one of the things I want you to consider, this piece of furniture was made before 1790 and was in that house. That's where its original home was, in that log house. And we oftentimes think of log cabins as being a very rudimentary, dirt floor, very unfinished type of structure. Well, you wouldn't put this type of piece of furniture in a building like that in 1780 to 1790. And so this beautiful corner cupboard, very high style, made by Moses Crawford. And Moses Crawford was also a housewright in the early period of Tennessee history. So he and his apprentices and journeymen would have been working and building buildings such as the one that you saw on the previous page, as well as making fine furniture and fine adornments inside the homes after that time. Moses Crawford died in 1819, and at his estate sale a short time later we find his tools, which consist of cabinet making and carpentry tools, being purchased by an Andrew Hall, formerly of Granger County. And we're going to return to that, so remember that point in just a few minutes. All right. The next house we're going to look at, you're probably familiar with as well. This is the home of Colonel Francis Alexander Ramsey. He was the father of J.M.G. Ramsey, who was one of our historians, state historians that wrote the Annals of Tennessee. Judge Haywood was considered one of our first historians, and he picked it up. Ramsey picked it up after that. Judge J.M.G. Ramsey was able to complete his first of 3 volumes of early Tennessee history. And this first volume, the Annals of Tennessee, deals with the beginnings of the frontier up through 1800. And if you're able to get a copy of that book, it's well worth reading. One of the things about talking about history and about history's ideas changing is the fact that I was able to get a copy of the biography of Ramsey, and in that it has many letters from the other historian from Wisconsin that wrote many stories, actually wrote the book, The Battle of Kings Mountain, if you're familiar with that. But they were conversing. They were contemporary. They were conversing back and forth. And one of the things that really impressed me in the letters, as you read, they would get to not arguing, but making sure they agreed that the accounts that layman would get, Layman Draper, that the accounts, those early accounts of the Revolutionary period, the early settlement period that Draper would get, the early accounts that Ramsey would get, they would make sure they fit together. And they would make sure they wouldn't put it down as fact until they had agreeing statements from various sources that collaborated an event that happened, which I thought was very important. Even back then, they're trying to make sure that the history that they get written down is as correct as they possibly could get. So very important. This house was built by an English architect, Thomas Hope. Thomas Hope also built some other houses around in Knoxville other than Swan Pond, or what we now call Ramsey House, there outside of Knoxville on the Holston River. This house, even though it's not log, is built of course stone, or what we call some early parts of Tennessee marble. There's a marble plants all around this house now. I think they're pretty much defunct, but they still pulled out a lot of marble on the original plantation property. This next home is the home of Colonel Joseph Rogers, the founder of Rogersville. And the top picture actually shows Rogers Tavern, the way it looked just a few years ago. Well, in understanding that houses do develop stories, or we do find out stories about these houses, so it was very important, we understood that the historic part of this home, being an early home, to be Joseph Rogers Tavern. We now know that an additional piece of story that came to light from part of Lewis and Clark. And we now know that on one journey that William Clark was making with his family from St. Louis back to deliver journal papers to Jefferson Davis in Washington, Tennessee, or Washington, D.C., he was stopped along at Rogers Tavern and spent the night. and he actually comments about how the food was and how the roads were around there. An interesting fact about this is the fact that he was making on a carriage in 1809, he's making as much as 26 to 28 miles a day, which is remarkable in a carriage with his family and small children. Sort of gives you an idea about the condition of the roads and how roads could have been used to carry goods back and forth. These are just a few of the notable historic 18th century structures that dotted the East Tennessee landscape, all of which were constructed by master house rights or for the original owner occupants. By researching and studying surviving documents and understanding life norms of the period, we can begin to unravel the hidden secrets of these historic structures and who could have been skilled enough to construct them. One of the next questions that we often find ourselves looking at is, how do we date a building? How do we come up with the date? And most of the time it is through different kinds of elements that we look at in the house. In this question, we probably find the hardest resolved answer. There has long been a conflict between real documented evidence and the assigned dating of historic structures. In the past, researchers and history writers have relied heavily on family stories and supplemented with selected legal documents to prove the dates of the structures. Other means of dating soon became utilized. The technique of association, meaning by examining the building fabric, that is the building material, hardware, architectural style, construction tools and techniques used by the builders, researchers could begin to assign dates by comparing those with other structures with known dates. If we just look at a log building today, we find ourselves more often as not perplexed about the construction date, because we now know our ancestors started building log homes in America over 400 years ago, and in Europe much longer. Some log buildings in Europe have been standing for more than 600 years. Even in the comparatively short time span of Tennessee's 250-year history, log home construction was the prevailing building style, with many of the same ancient construction techniques and tools still employed by the builders throughout this entire period. And as I said, one dating technique for historic structures is the examination of the hardware and fasteners that were used in the building. Everybody knows what a wrought nail is, a hand-wrought nail, right? And what do we often hear? That hand-wrought nails are terribly expensive, and they burn their houses down to select them and move them on to the next house. Is that right? How many of you ever heard that story? Lots of times. Lots of times. Actually, part of that is true. I had often thought, well, how could that possibly be? Because I've worked with blacksmith. I've worked in a blacksmith shop before. I've made nails before. They're not hard to make. What's hard is to learn how to heat them, to make them in the right heat, and to work them out. But they're not hard to make. You do learn some blacksmithing skills in the art of making nails, but they're not hard to make. What we have found out is that they did burn their houses down to get the nails. However, the King of England put an end to that in 1640. Before 1640, the colonists that were sent over to the New World were sent here for one purpose. What do you remember that purpose was? To supply raw materials back to England. They did not have any ownership of any property. They didn't own anything. They were here at the will and pleasure of the crown. They didn't own anything. They were sent here because it was a way to make a livelihood on property and land in England that they could not make a living, but in the New World they could. But they were not owners of any of the new land. The king owned the land, and so they were to supply goods and services or raw material back to England. That was their purpose. In so doing, they had to build shelters, and some of those shelters were very haphazardly made hovels to hold as a temporary shelter for them to work in, to live in, until they had taken all the natural resources in that area, and then they would move on to the next area and start taking the natural resources for that to put back on the ships to send back to England. In return, the King of England would then send back things that they could not make, because there were no iron furnaces here in the New World at that time. And so iron products would have been a viable product to bring back to England. However, when he gave the law that said that you can no longer burn your house down, he also said this doesn't give you any reason to not pay your tax. You're still going to get taxed. But in return, I'm going to give you enough nails to build the next house. And so you don't have to worry about taking the nails out of the burned down house. We're just going to give you enough nails in order to do that. And so part of that story is true, but that dates back over 300 years ago of burning your house down to get the nails.
Those early houses were very tall. What was the reason for that?
I don't know that I have a definite answer for you, other than the fact that what I may understand about physics and heat rising is that the lower the ceiling in the summertime, it's going to be warmer in there, so you're not going to spend as much time. If you get a higher ceiling, then heat will rise, and the area that you're walking around and living in is going to stay cooler. And so that would be a reason. Now, if that's any more than an architectural reason that they did that. But once again, they were designing and building structures that they were used to living in when they were still living in England. And so they would just bring those skills and designs with them because they had worked in England, they'd worked in Europe, and so they brought those with them. We do know that the pitch of roofs were very tall. Once again, for a physical reason, is the fact that the roofing material was shingles or boards. And the steeper you made the roof of a shingle or a board roof, the quicker the moisture would run off. The snow, the rain would run away, and instead of running inside the building, it would run away very quickly. And so that helped not only shed the water quickly, but also helped preserve the lumber. The roofing material would last longer if you got the water away from it and allowed it to dry out quicker. As I mentioned earlier, through the Association of Historic Buildings, preservation still compare hardware of known buildings that are dated to hardware of the subject building. Handmade door and cabinet hinges, for example, such as strap and HL hinges, door latches, screws, nails, fasteners, all of these things were used. Other architectural features can also establish dates, such as the employed styles of the fenestration of the builder, that is the type of doors, flooring, windows, mantels, staircases, balustrades, and molding trim used to frame out these elements. And you can see here types of handmade hardware. Most of you are probably really familiar with the strap hinge, a pinless strap hinge used for a door or for a shutter, but also the H and HL hinges that you see there that were made. All of these were more than likely made like these were made in a blacksmith shop and used to cover to help maneuver the doors for hinges. Hardware that you see here, this top left one is an 18th century latch on a Tennessee door. The two in the center, the thumb latch, the front and back of the thumb latch, also of the 18th century period. The top right lock is a later period. This is an English import. This is a carpenter lock that was made available by 1810 to 1815 for the American colony, for the American market. And this door, actually, we know this door was actually put on this building by 1820. And so it now has its still original carpenter lock in place on the door. The one at the bottom, not all things came from England. This is what's called a Dutch elbow lock that we see on Tennessee buildings, early buildings. This is also an 18th century latch lock that would have locked the doors both with a key, and some would be with keys and some would be without keys. Another telling observation about how to date a building is through its auxiliary lumber that was sawn or milled. Now, in a log building, we all think, if I've got an axe, I can have a structure. I can build a log building. But how are you going to make the flooring? How are you going to make the mantels? How are you going to make the windows? How are you going to make the doors? Could be done with an axe, but not very efficiently. And so mills were some of the first things that came into the frontier, as well as hewing a log building out. The first type of milling was what we call pit sawing that you see here. on the bottom right, these two gentlemen are actually working with a timber, and they have a saw. One's at the bottom, one's at the top, and they're sawing out a timber to make a board. The one on the left there is what's called a sash mill, and with a water-powered sash mill with the blades vertically moving up and down, and to create the boards out of the timber. And then, of course, the last one, the circle saw mill, which we see up there on the upper left, is the later type of milling. All of these saw blades will leave very distinctive marks. And so we can then pretty much ascertain the period of when these types of tools were in use or not in use. When did they go out of fashion? We know that the circle saw was patented in the late 1700s in England, but wasn't put into use in America for actually milling lumber until the mid-1800s. So we pretty well know that if we see circle saw marks on boards inside a log building or any other historic building, that material wasn't put there until after that period. They were still in the process of using the sash mill marks or the pit saw mark. But the saw marks are telling about the date of those buildings. The next type of dating types of period dating techniques is that that was developed by the Geographical Climate Studies Department, and that is tree ring dating or dendrochronology. And that has become more and more of a scientific approach to dating structures. Fortunately, but sometimes unfortunately, these dating techniques oftentimes dispels the treasured time-honored beliefs of a previously dated historic structure being much younger than originally thought. Case in point, William Blount's territorial home or office home log building in what's called Rocky Mount outside of Johnson City in Sullivan County, Tennessee, was a state historic property, is a state historic property that was slated as the actual building that William Blount used as his territorial office. Through dendrochronology, we now know that that building was not built until 1820s, 1825. So in no way that building could have been used by Governor Blount as a territorial governor for the state of Tennessee. So, once again, some of these beliefs that we think are absolute can change, and so we do have to be adapted to those kinds of things. The next thing we want to look at are the types of log buildings and how buildings were constructed. And many of you are probably very familiar with these, and we look at them as how they were built pretty much like a box, if you will. A box that had logs that were joined at the corner, just like you would have a square or rectangle wooden box. They were built pretty much the same way. This type of construction was very sturdy and very secure against the elements. And these buildings were built as what we call pins, P-E-N-S. And you have a 1-pin or a 2-pin or a 2-pin with a dog trot in between, or you have a 2-pin with a central log wall with a chimney in the center. Sometimes you'll have the chimney on an exterior wall, but sometimes you'll have a chimney in the center of the 2 pins as the building, depending on the need of the original owner, what he needs. Sometimes these buildings are enlarged to include these additional pins, but pretty much they're designed around a pin unit where you have 4 corners that are actually structurally holding the building together. And you can see here the single pin there on the left, and then the double pin up there at the top, the saddlebag with the chimney in the center, and the ever famous dog trot there at the bottom. The dog trot is a 2-pin structure with a breezeway in between, which is called, I've heard it called a turkey trot, a dog trot, and those kinds of things. But it's basically a breezeway or a work area between it. Oftentimes this area gets closed in, but I've seen this dog trot configuration used in one of the largest log buildings in Tennessee, in Wynwood. It is the largest stagecoach inn in the state of Tennessee, and at one time was considered to be the largest log building east of the Mississippi River. And it still stands today. A few years ago, unfortunately, it was hit by a tornado, and the top floors were blown off of it, but they were able to get it reconstructed and redone, so it still stands today I don't have a picture of that because it wasn't an East Tennessee building, but it is unique. If you ever get the opportunity to see it, it's outside of Gallatin in Sumner County. The dimensions of these buildings, another thing that we often think about is what size are they? Some of the smallest log buildings that people lived in were 12 by 16, sometimes even a little bit smaller. But they got up to being very large, 24 feet by 36 feet for a single pen. And also multiple stories. I think we talked earlier about stories about the buildings getting larger and larger. Some of the earlier buildings in the state were very large, as we saw in those early pictures. Those early frontier buildings were quite substantial in size. And so we have all varies of that as we look at it. The notching techniques that we see on log buildings today are pretty much this example you see on the left-hand side. There's 6 different varieties there, depending on how the building was going to be used. The top left one is what's called a saddlebag, where the logs are left around and they're just notched out, and each log or next is just laid on top. The ends are not cut off because it's basically a temporary building. It was never intended for any long use. Some of them do last a little bit longer, but they have nice wide overhangs that overshadow, keep the water off the logs to help preserve it. But still, they suffer greatly because of that type of construction technique. And on down through there, the rest of the 5, deal with a hewn surface that you see here on the face, on the table. These logs were hewn to be flat on both sides, left round, usually on the top, not totally squared off. Some of them were, but not totally squared off. But this would be a typical log that you see here on the table that would have been hewn out and then notched at the corner at the respecting notches. One of the things that we first thought years ago was that the types of notching techniques could date a building. And they could have years and years before they moved into the Tennessee frontier. But by the time these techniques the settlers moved into Tennessee, they were incorporating all of these types of notching techniques. And so it's very difficult to date any log building given its type of notching at the corners. The next notching technique you'll see there is the diamond notching that we saw on the Crawford house. The one below that is the half dovetail. The one above is the V notching, like this larger picture here on the right. The next one is a full dovetail, still uncommon, but does occasionally happen. And then the bottom one is the square notching. The square notching we find on log buildings in Tennessee that were constructed much later in Tennessee's history, more toward the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. We see them incorporating this type of notching technique. An interesting note about the full dovetail is the fact that even though it is rare, it is considered to be an earlier type of construction technique. The notches on the logs serve various purposes other than just holding the building together. The type of notch that is employed will help water move away from the interior of the joint. And if you look at how the geometry is made of the notch, you'll see that when water hits the outside, it's all of the lines move the water to the outside instead of to the inside, which would cause the joint to rot away. The next component of log construction is the chinking and daubing. Chinking is considered to be the solid material wedged in between the log joints to provide the base for the masonry daubing. What we often see are 2 basic types, stone and wood wedges. This material serves 2 purposes. First, it is a backing surface for the daubing mix that will key into the space, and the second, through this wedging action, provide a vertical support for the log above. There is some speculation that the stone infill was also important for stopping bullets penetrating to the interior from would-be attackers. Most of the earliest remaining log structures we see today contain stone infill. Of course, the earliest structures would have been subjected to still Indian problems. And so if you're a log home builder, or if you're an owner at that period, you would have probably wanted something to help protect you as much as possible. Even though I've not found any documented evidence for this fact for stone chinking, it does make sense. Most, if not all, of the families living in the backcountry had experienced warfare with the native Indian. It would not be unreasonable to want to make sure your home is secure as possible against such a threat. The next component that we want to look at is the daubing. And the daubing then is the masonry mix that is used to seal the interior and the exterior of the chink joint. While it seems that most of our modern log house experts seem to think this material was just simply a clay mud daubing made from dirt sourced from around the log cabin foundation and mixed with water and shoved into the joints, unfortunately, this is far from the truth. Analysis of the original log structure daubing that still remain in those original structures consists basically of no clay dirt at all. It is a mixture of hydrated lime, sand, sometimes with a binder added, and water. This formula is also very exacting and consistent with the daubing that we see that's been originally left. The top coat of the daubing is simply a lime wash coat, giving the outward look of a smooth white or off-white appearance that you can see here in these images. The joint is also tooled with a trowel to allow the rainwater to shed away from the log below. While the top log of lime will repel water away, the properties of the lime also allow the joint to breathe by not trapping moisture next to the enclosed wood, where we know that our modern cement and mortar mix acts as a sponge and is very hard on the surface. The lime masonry is hard enough to be structural, but not so hard as to cause damage due to natural movement and expansion and contraction of the adjacent material. These properties of lime masonry have been understood and used by our ancestral builders for over 6,000 years. So you'd think they'd have it down by now. In this image right here, you can see pointing at this original masonry still in the long joint right there. And what color is it? It is white. And you see here. And it's hard to see this one, but I've sort of put this magnification over this. This is all sand and lime mix. And right here is some lime, hydrated lime that's still there. Still in there. You can actually see the real component of what makes that mortar mix work. And this was put in this log by 1790 and still there. And now on a more personal note, Randall mentioned that I had lived in a log house. We lived in a log building, historic log building. And after living in one for over 20 years, I will try to tell some of the story of one of those early houses. The story as we know it today began prior to 1791 on a tract of land situated on the north side of the Holston River, just a few hundred yards out of the floodplain, where two well-traveled Indian trails crossed, one coming from the east from the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, through the Anchorage, crossing Interstate 81, and onto the Holston River at Mitchell Bend in Tampico. Fording the river and the trace then crossed the Buffalo Trail, now called Indian Ridge Road. The trail then meandered onto and crossed the Clinching Powell Rivers in the direction of the Cumberland Mountain Range, passing through the Gap and finally into the land of Kentucky. It was at this crossing location that a pioneer by the name of Aquila Mitchell had two large log buildings constructed, and soon after, because of the chosen strategic location, set up a store and tavern. Mitchell Tavern at Tampico operated from the late 1700s up until the 1860s, when the occupying Union troops destroyed the estate. The camping Union Army took the fencing for firewood and stole and killed all the remaining livestock. The soldiers also emptied the store's coffers as well as the stored provisions, even those left as staples for the old men, women, and children. And that's not something that's made up. This is an actual federal document, legal document that was sent to the federal government by the Aquila Mitchell Jr. to get reimbursed. Even though Aquila Mitchell Jr. had all of the officers signed notes for what they took from the property, the vouchers to the federal government were denied, and the reimbursement stating invalid, denied. And just simply invalid, denied. So they never got any reimbursement for it. Descendants of the Mitchell family continued to live in the home place until the death of Miss Pearl Mitchell Davis in 1975. and the building sat neglected and vacant until 1992. Late in 1986, while traveling the byways of Tennessee back roads, I came across the remains of a log building, today totally covered in vines and trees. On closer inspection, I discovered what remained of the structure was definitely worth saving. After much search, I located the local owner and descended and made my inquiry as to the possibility of purchasing the structure and a small plot of ground on which it stood. The owner was very gracious, but denied being ready to sell the site or building. He did remark that he might at some point sell just the building, but never the land. I understood, but left my phone number and business card in his hands with the hope that when and if he does decide to sell, he might give me a call. Fast forward to 1982. The long-forgotten hope of that phone call ever coming rang. I was thrilled with the prospect of owning this historic log building, even though at the time I knew nothing of his past story. After purchasing the building, what do you suppose my first questions were? How old is it? Who built it? Why was it built right here? What kind of building is this? I knew it was log, but I didn't know any of the story. So, I'm just spilling out all these questions. And the story begins. Upon my purchase, I now can't remember totally all of my questions I must have asked about the building's history. The past owner handed me a small stack of papers containing the above photograph and the 1963 Jefferson County Press article written about the old Granger County log building. Written in the first line of the article, it reads, one of the oldest log homes in Granger County. Also early in its history, the log building had served the community as a station and tavern where travelers could buy supplies and if needed, a room for the night. The article mentioned a round stone with the inscription chiseled in the center with the initials AH, who the current occupant at the 1963 period believed was a builder by the name of A. Hammond. Also, the log home was built for an early pioneer by the name of Aquila Mitchell. The article continued with the additional information taken from the family Bible, all of the births and deaths of the children, with the statement that the oldest child, Salith, being born in the home March 1791. With this one stroke of luck, I had just discovered a tremendous amount of the building's story. The first owner was a man by the name of Aquila Mitchell, a tavern and storekeeper. The building had to have been completed prior to 1791 or earlier, and the possible builder was a man by the name of A. Hammond. Since I was not able to purchase the house and lot, the building had to be dismantled piece by piece and transported to its current location. Within a couple of years, funds were secured and the restoration and reconstruction began. Today, the log building stands reflecting its period that it might have looked between the years 1800 and 1825, at the height of its store and tavern period. At this point, we need to revisit the story of the Crawford log building and Moses Crawford of that late 1700s home there in North Knox County. Moses Crawford's Tennessee is considered, once again, one of Tennessee's first housewrights and furniture makers. After extensive research through many archival documents, I have been unable to find anyone living in that area by the name of A. Hammond. What I have been able to find is a family of master housewrights living in that portion of Granger County, formerly Knox County, by the name of Hall. Two such men with the name A. Hall, father and son. Looking back a few pages, we see at the death of Moses Crawford, Tennessee's first house builder in 1819, we find Andrew Hall purchasing all of Moses Crawford's carpentry tools. The Halls were contemporary craftsmen with Crawford in the Upper Tennessee settlements. Andrew Hall, being a master housewright, would have had apprentices who, upon reaching the age of 21, he would have had to supply them with a good set of tools. And so here we have him buying a set of tools from Moses Crawford, and he is Andrew Hall. Once again, his initials are AH. So more than likely, instead of it being A. Hammond, it was Andrew Hall, an actual housewright that was living in the area at the time this house was built. Here are some views of the interior of the house as it is today. This is where we live. This is the interior of one of the front rooms and the fireplaces. This tavern, at the time that we took it down, had 7 fireplaces in it.
How many did you keep? How many fireplaces?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the till room that would have been used to store the beverages for ones wanting to experience some of the local spirits.
Was that the original hinge on that door?
Hinge and lock.
And the floor? No.
Yeah, no, the floor is not original. It was originally ash floor, and it is an ash floor, but it was originally an ash floor. It was not really savable at that point. Now, the upper floor is original. The one you see in the ceiling, that's the upper floor. The ceiling joists are hand-planed and beaded, but once again, you can see all of these types of tools that would have been needed by a house right to build a log building on the frontier.
How about the mantle piece?
They're original. They all match. And you can see the 3 lights above the doors there. That was very typical of that earlier period as well. And then that's the house as it stands today on the farm.
Yeah, ended that.
That concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them as best I can. All right.
Let's all give
Thank
Ben a
you.
hand. And you're all invited to stay for the refreshments and continue to ask Ben questions. Where'd he go? Oh, here he is. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it.